I remember a time when I was sitting at my kitchen table about to do my devotions and I realized I didn't want to do this. I didn't want to do my devotions. That moment, that led to really a series of life changes for me that have really come to, flowing all the way through my education and everything until I get to where I am today. And in this video, I want to talk a little bit about how that moment, how my devotions and how I think about devotions has changed significantly since that day. So, let's get in. Hey there, I'm Darryl Burling from Master New Testament Greek, and I help people with the tools, habits, and systems to master the Greek of the New Testament so that you can read the New Testament in your devotional time. Yes, in fact, that is true. And I want you to do that without having to deal with reader's editions and without having to deal with lexicons and all those kinds of things as well. And this is what I do today. And what a lot of people actually in Master New Testament Greek now do as well, is they're reading through their Bibles, their New Testaments, particularly in the original language, in the original Greek. So that's what I do today. But it was a long road going from that day at the kitchen table to where I am today. And it was not just about whether I read the Bible in English or Greek. Back then I was reading in English, now I'm reading in Greek. But that's not the issue. It doesn't matter whether you're reading the Bible in English or in Greek. I mean, there's benefits of reading it in Greek, and there's lots of videos on this channel which will hopefully talk about that. But the key thing here is that there's actually a whole pile of change that took place in me as a result of that day at the kitchen table. You see, what happened to me that day is I realized that I didn't want to do my devotions. I did not want to read the Bible. I did not want to pray. In fact, I still find in my heart often there's a reluctance and a resistance to prayer. And I really struggle with this. And I'm sure I'm not the only one. I'm sure other people do as well. And if you do, then, hit the like button and share your comments and your experience in the comment section below. I'd love to hear from you. So with that, let me just share, first of all, one of the key things that I learned. And it wasn't really right away at that time, but here's the thing I learned at that moment as I asked myself, why don't I want to do my devotional times? I realized that I felt at that moment that I did not need God. That was fundamentally what I felt. Now, clearly, that is wrong, that is sinful, that is a element of my own corruption coming out right there, and God is worthy of my heart. God is worthy of my worship. And if I don't feel like I want to worship Him or like I need Him, the problem is not with God, but with me. And that's what I came to that day. I found that the way I felt in that moment about my own devotion told me more about myself and my need of Christ than really, a lot of the things that I'd been reading even in my Bible. Not to say that those things weren't important, they really helped me to understand that point. But at the same time, there's an element of truth to the fact that we learn about God as well as we learn about ourselves. The more self-aware we become, the more aware we become of God and His grace and His mercy and His kindness and how specifically that applies to us. The more we are aware of our sinfulness and our corruption, then the more God's grace appears glorious and wonderful to us. And that's really the journey that I began that day. After that, it was a little bit after that, not very long actually, and I started my educational trip, right, where I started going down the track and eventually earning, going through a bachelor's degree, master's degree, eventually becoming or having a doctorate. So, and I was focused, as I went through all of that, I was really focused on understanding what it means to be human, how we relate to God, how all of this relates to just living in a Christian manner. And so that day at the kitchen table really led to a whole pile of learning and a whole pile of things that took place there. Let me just share a couple of things with you in this video that I think will help you in your devotional times. At least that's my intention, to help you with your devotional times so that you have some clarity about where you're going. And at the end of this video, I'm going to share a resource with you that you can download for free, which will help you with your devotional times. So let's talk first of all about the purpose of devotions, because I think one of the things that a lot of people struggle with is they know that Christians should be doing devotions, but they don't really understand why. Why do we do this? Why do we have to read the Bible every day? I mean, if you've read it once, surely isn't that enough? Well, here's the thing. It all comes back to this question of why does God save people? Now, some people might argue that God saves people just because he's merciful and we're sinners and we need to go to heaven. Well, we don't need to go to heaven according to God's standards. God will be glorified whether we go to heaven or not go to heaven, right? That's not the issue. And ultimately, God is working out all things for his purposes and his plan. And his ultimate goal, as far as we can tell in Scripture, is for his glory and his greatness to be magnified, not just in the sense of his power, but also in terms of his grace and his mercy, which is why sinners are saved, because God's wanting to show and demonstrate his mercy and his grace. And so that's why sinners are saved. But when he saves sinners, he doesn't just save them for their benefit, but for his. And so part of his purpose in saving sinners is to transform them into the image of Christ. Romans 8, verse 29. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son. Here's why God chooses, why God predestines to conform people to the image of his Son. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount said, therefore be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Paul made it his aim, whether he was away or whether he was at home, and by that he meant whether he was in heaven or on earth, to make it his goal to be pleasing to the Lord. In other words, to live in a manner that the Lord is pleased by and enjoys. And this really comes down to this whole thing about personal transformation. Romans chapter 12, verse 2, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And the whole goal here of the Christian life, for those of you and I, those of us who've been saved by God's grace, redeemed from our sin and transferred into the kingdom of his beloved Son, the goal that God has for us is that we be transformed into the image of Christ. That means that we're changed, our character is changed, the way we think is changed, the way we feel is changed, and then the things that we do and the choices we make are different, under totally a fundamentally different kind of regime, under the rule of Christ, if you like, rather than just under the rule of whatever I feel is the right thing to do. And that day at the table, I realized that I was being led by my desires and not by what God called me to or by God's worthiness. I was being driven by something other than what I should be. And so that really led me to understand that my time in that devotional time is really about helping me to grow more Christ-like, helping me to become holy. I'm not saved by my devotions, I'm not arguing that, but the point here is that we are saved so that we will become Christ-like, and that devotional time is the time that we set aside so that we can become Christ-like, which means then that starts to shape the way we spend that time. And let me just give you a couple of things that I've found really helpful. Secondly, as a way to help shape yourself into the image of Christ through those devotional times. First of all, you want to be focused not so much on how much you read, but on how much time you spend and how well you spend that time. And there's a couple of things I've found really helpful here. First of all, obviously, having a reading plan is very good, and you don't have to read the Bible in a year. You can, and I recommend you do that, but you could read the Bible slower than that. You could read it faster than that. I've done, even just this year, I read the Old Testament in 3 months. Now I'm reading the New Testament in Greek in 6 months. In other times, I've read through the Bible chronologically in a year. Sometimes I've not read through the whole Bible in a year, but taken a couple of years just to work slowly through certain things. So just have a reading plan. It doesn't matter how fast or slow you go. But the point is that you're getting something out of that reading every day. And how do you get something out of that reading? Well, here's where I really recommend journaling. A couple of reasons for this. First of all, one of the things I find really helpful when I journal is to have prompts, right? These prompts are there to ask me key questions that are good for my soul, for me to be asked on a regular basis, such as, how do I feel right now? Because if I'm like I was that day when I sat at my kitchen table, I didn't feel like worshiping, I didn't feel like reading my Bible, then I need to address that feeling and write that down and then start to examine why that is and then correct it, really. And often this is a really good tool for me, because what I find is I do this and I find that I have those feelings there that are unworthy of the Lord, that I don't want to do this. I then use those feelings to go back to the Lord and ask Him to forgive me for the corruption that is there, to cleanse me from it and help me to grow more Christ-like. And honestly, just like everybody else, I struggle like everybody. I'm a human being just like every other person on the planet. But the thing is here that this question helps me to examine my heart before I even come to that devotional time so that I can come to that devotional time. The second thing I ask myself in my journal, is just as a prompt, is, what am I going to give thanks for today? And I choose 3 things every day just to give thanks to the Lord for. They might be little things, maybe just in the day-to-day of life. It might be a little thing like I have a home, or, something small that somebody did for me, or maybe having my family around me. But in some days where big things happen, those are obviously good things to give thanks for as well. But the point is that every day there is something to give thanks to the Lord for, and I want to make sure that my heart is focused on what the Lord is giving me and doing and giving thanks for that, rather than focusing on what I don't have. Okay, because it's easy for me to focus on what I don't have, what I want, and what I feel that I need, rather than all the good that the Lord has given to me. So that's the second prompt. The third prompt I have is just, what am I reading, and just to take something out of it. And here I look for examples to follow in the scriptures, like maybe David and his deference to Saul, or maybe it's an example to not follow, like perhaps Judas and his betrayal of Christ, or even Peter and some of his rashness. It could be, something that is stated as true that I need to believe. It could be a command that I need to obey, or a command not to obey if it's written by, somebody who's not pleasing to the Lord. But there's always things like that to find in my reading, and I want to make notes of those things. So I'm looking for things that are shown to be good in the scriptures so that I can think that way, feel that way, and do those things, rather than the things that I feel I want to do. And of course this changes on a day-by-day basis based on where I'm at and what's going on in life and so on. But just making a little note on 1 or 2 of those things then feeds into the last point that I work through in my devotional time, and that is prayer. Right? Then what I do is I will pray about those things. So if I'm looking at David and his deference to Saul, and how even though he was being hunted by Saul, he still saw Saul as the Lord's anointed and therefore wouldn't raise his hand against him. If that's the case, then how can I replicate that? And so I might pray something along the lines of, Lord, help me to respect authority the way David did as well, because that's the kind of thing that I need to do. And tendency of my heart is not to obey, but not to think highly of leaders, not to pray for my leaders, but to actually just think lowly of them, think less of them than I ought to, rather than as the Lord calls me to. So those are the sorts of things I'm looking for. And then of course I'll pray about that. I'll add a few other people and things that I'm praying about from a prayer list to my list. And that's my devotional time. And all of that is structured through journaling. And I find journaling really helpful for working through this element of my devotional time. The other thing I really want to mention here is that there are advantages to using paper Bibles and notebooks. I've used for a long time notebooks like this Leuchtturm notebook, which I really like, dot paper, and I write out those prompts in there and then answer them just with a pen and paper, and that's really good. It's a great way of avoiding distractions. And then just using a paper Bible like the Tyndale Greek New Testament, or if you're using another Bible, those are great as well. But using paper rather than technology, the benefit of that is that you don't have the distractions of technology. It's you're using different parts of your brain. In fact, there's a whole video I did on this, which I'll link to just up here, that you can see the advantages of analog. But today, most of the time, pretty much always now, I'm using digital. And the reason for that is really that the circumstances in which I live, the nature of our home, the way it's laid out, the way I structure my mornings, and the things that are likely to interrupt me and stop me from doing a devotional time, I find it's easier to be consistent with digital rather than with analog. Now, I still think there are benefits of analog, but I have sort of reverted a little bit to say that use whatever works really at the end of the day. So I use Logos Bible software, I use Obsidian, and I use an iPad Pro, which I can then type in my notes. And that also has the advantage of I don't have to be quite as precise as if I'm writing things out by hand. I'm not worried about making mistakes, that I can just delete them and rewrite them. Whereas writing by hand does require that extra discipline, which is actually a good thing. And that's one of the benefits of writing, is that it does force you to think more deeply and carefully before you put pen to paper, so to speak. But typing allows you to write more. So there's pros and cons of both of those. So with that, then those are the things that I do in my devotions. I'd love to hear from you. What do you do? Leave a comment in the comment section below. And if you found this helpful, hit that like button as well. Now, if you're interested in learning more about this, if you want more details on how to have a meaningful and well-structured devotional time, then go to mntg.me/devotions, and there that'll lead you to my personal website, and there you'll be able to find a link to download a guide to, structuring your devotional times in a way that will help you to have deeper and richer quiet time. So go to do that, mntg.me/devotions. I look forward to serving you that way. If you are interested in learning Greek and being able to read, say, your Tyndale Greek New Testament in your devotional time, then go to mntg.me/roadmap, get your roadmap to mastery to learn how the whole process for learning Greek works. And I look forward to serving you in the next video. Until then, keep taking small, consistent steps, not only toward mastery of the Greek New Testament, but also to mastery of your own soul in submitting it to Christ and to his rule. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. We'll see you then.